Okay, well, welcome everyone to this afternoon parallel session, or at least it's the afternoon in Europe. So this session is session 2.1, energy transition and local governance, and we've got an impressive lineup of speakers. Each of the speakers has pre-recorded their talk, but is going to be present. So what I encourage you to do is that we'll play each video in turn, and you can be asking questions or making comments in the chat as we go along, and the speakers are here to respond to those comments, and then we will hopefully collect some minutes of time at the end when we can have an open panel Q&A. So that's how we're going to run the session. I'm delighted to welcome 4 speakers this afternoon. I'll say a very brief introduction to who they are before each one of them. So we've got the CEO of Enedis, Miss Marianne Laigneau, is going to give the first talk, and I'm delighted to say that Christophe Bonnery is here from Enedis to respond to any questions that may come up following her talk. So if we can play the first video, that would be great.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear professor and honorable speakers, I am Marianne Laigneau, the CEO of Enedis, the main French power DSO. I am very honored to be taking part into your first international conference online, and I would like to thank your chairman, Christophe Bonnery, for this opportunity. I deeply regret not to be able to participate with you on live to our session dedicated to energy transition and local governance. Nevertheless, I will try to share with you my thoughts on this topic from the point of view of the company I manage. In many aspects, energy transition and local governance are key drivers of our business model. First, let me give you some key facts about our company, Enedis. We are a public utility service company. We operate medium and low voltage power grids, which physically deliver electric power to more than 37 million customers on behalf of 80 energy suppliers. Total length of power grids we operate is equivalent to 35 times Earth's circumference. We account for about 15% of the power DSO's ecosystem in European Union. Our service area covers 95% of French mainland territory, so we deliver electric power to local communities in all types of territories, cities and urban areas, including metropolises, such as Great Paris area, but also very rural and remote territories. A specificity, in France, distribution power grids are owned by local public authorities, mainly MUNIPs. We operate power grids under about 400 concession contracts. Due to this concession-based model, it is vital to us to have a close and constructive relationship with local public authorities, not only as owners of the power grids, but also as energy policymakers. Coming now to energy transition. As a power DSO, we see the following trends in the field. First trend is decentralization. By law, French subregions and metropolis are responsible for energy policy. And as power DSO, we help them to define their local climate plan and support their local energy projects. Second, decentralization comes along with the development of new renewable energies from wind, solar, and bioenergy sources. 60% of the renewable energies potential comes from rural areas in MUNIPs with less than 2,000 inhabitants. Easy to understand. It's because where land is available. Another trend or characteristic of energy transition is decarbonation of energy through electricity. It is clear that with a low-carbon power production mix, electrification of uses makes sense, especially in transport and building sectors, which concentrate, as you know, nearly 50% of GHG emissions. In that context, new uses of electricity are developing. EV mobility, heat pumps, also green hydrogen projects. With thermal renovation of buildings, these are some of the top priorities set in the post-COVID crisis recovery plans, both in Europe and in France, which targeting greener economy. But it is not only about energy or earnings, but also there is a trend towards new societal aspirations or expectations. How we can produce, consume, work, travel in a more local, more green, more sober way. It's true that the COVID crisis has also allowed teleworking to be experimented on a larger scale. The development of more circular economy, bringing local jobs, is on the agenda. In the power energy field, for example, we notice that self-consumption is a new way people want to consume. Some customers are ready to pay a little more for that, and it is new. This is why at Enedis, instead of energy transition, we rather consider the broader concept of ecological transition, which reflects a more holistic approach. Our vision of energy transition is both industry and society-driven, and we put ecological transition at the heart of our corporate project. So, ecological transition comes along with a much more decentralized way of paving the future. In this ecological transition landscape, what is the place of distribution power grids? It's very simple. Distribution power grids are the backbone of this ecological transition. Let's just have a quick look now on the facts and data. In France today, we manage more than 90.9% of customers, representing 75% of the national power balance. 93% of new renewables energies are connected to distribution power grids. 100% of electric mobility infrastructure, whatever their power level, are connected to power grids we operate. Also, distribution power grids link all territories together, allowing transfers of power from renewable sources from one territory to another. This is particularly crucial for urban areas, which highly depends today on other territories to import the power they need. So, distribution power grids are no more the last mile operator. We are already a backbone of ecological transition. And our responsibility is supporting projects of all ecological transition actors. In order to achieve that, we can rely on several tools. Let me focus just on a few of them. First of all, smart grids are the central technological tool. Smart grids technologies are the nervous system of power grids, enabling massive integration of distributed and intermittent renewable energy sources, supporting the development of electric vehicles, multi-energy grids, and smart buildings. In a nutshell, you want ecological transition, make your power grid smart. Within smart technologies, smart meters are for sure one of the greatest assets today for ecological transition. At Enedis, we are finishing this year, and we are very proud of it, to roll out our smart metering system called Linky. 32 million customers are already equipped and connected to the system, which represent nearly 90% of business and residential customers. It is a €4 billion program initiated in 2016, and we are on time and a bit less under budget. Empowerment of customers and their power suppliers is growing. Innovative power supply offers have multiplied. We have 20 of them today. And equipped customers express satisfaction with the features of the new meter. Our smart meter AMM offer facilitates also the development of self-consumption projects. It is also a key tool for further development of EV smart charging solutions. But technology itself is just a part of the answer. Another essential factor lies, of course, in economic signals sent to customers and all stakeholders of ecological transition. As you know, power grids access tariffs represent in France about 30% of the final electricity bill of a residential customer, including taxes. 1/3 is energy, 1/3 is grid accessed, and the last third is local and national taxes. These tariffs are regulated tariffs. They are equalized, so to say, between urban and rural areas and also at a national scale. Today, this tariff equalization for grid access is an essential part of our public electricity service. It reflects somehow the necessary solidarity between all territories. As I said earlier, in fact, we need to build some power lines in rural territories in order to provide urban areas with electric power from renewable sources. Also in France, tariff equalization contributes to social cohesion, to the fight against exclusion, and to a balanced development of our country. I will leave to you, of course, energy economists, the very interesting debate on what could be most relevant tariff model for power grids from the point of view of economic theory. But from our power DSO experience, our contribution to the ecological transition required a balanced system. We need proper signal tariffs to favor energy transition and also to be sure that nobody will be left aside. Economic efficiency is also important to meet the needs of the most modest households and make ecological transition solutions to be affordable. In connection with the question of tariffs comes the issue of the necessary level of investments on power grids required in order to guarantee a sustainable energy transition. Today, just Enedis, we invest around 3.5 billion euros per year without linking against 2.5 billion euros 10 years ago, which is a plus 40% increase during the last 10 years. This trend to increase investment on power grids is confirmed as we anticipate to invest more than 60 billion euros over the period starting from 2021 to 2035. It's true outside France as well. By 2030, for the whole European Union and UK, electric distribution power grids will require at least 400 billion euros of investment, reaching on annual rate around 40 billion euros. It is a growth of 60% compared to the level of 26 billion euros in 2019. Increasing investments are necessary to ensure resilience both on the physical side of power grids as well on the cybersecurity side, which has already become a strategic issue for a power DSO like Enedis. We also know for sure that we can count on the strong support of the European Commission. Electricity distribution power grids are now recognized in the EU taxonomy as contributing to climate change mitigation and adaptation. It is key because that will allow us to access to even more funding to accelerate the implementation of the ecological transition. Before to conclude, power grids are very long-term investment lasting several decades in order to guarantee the most effective sizing of power grids and the economic efficiency of the associated investment. it is crucial for us to draw up very long-term power grids development plans, taking into account all trends associated with ecological transition. We have just published a prospective study for 2050 on the challenges of transforming power grids, let's say in a bottom-up approach based on local indicators such as demography, housing, economic activity, meteorology, changing transport and consumption habits. What are the main conclusions of our report? Growth in electricity consumption will remain moderate, but sizing of distribution power grids will increasingly be based on local generation. In some scenarios, the investments necessary to integrate new installations on power distribution grids will increase according to the local share of wind and solar generation. Just to give you an idea, out of our total 4 billion euros investment per year, we invest today around 2 billion euros just in connections and associated grids extension. By 2050, such investments could reach between 6 and 8 billion euros per year in a 100% renewable scenario. As a conclusion, the next 30 years will be those of the ecological transition. Ecological transition is questioning the modes of production, consumption, and management of energy at local scales. It seeks to give territories more autonomy to determine their own energy policies. Power distribution grids, which are at the heart of this transformation, are already close partners of territories and local public authorities, supporting them in piloting their climate roadmap. It is key for power DSOs operators to anticipate the integration of high renewable production capacities, massive development of heat pumps or electric vehicles, in order to be able to manage demand shapes that will greatly vary from one territory to another. Meanwhile, with electrification of uses, ecological transition represents a significant potential for new jobs in the electricity sector and local ones, provided that the necessary skills will be available. Probably part of these new jobs will come from the fossil energy sector. Just to give you an idea, today, the French electrical industry as a whole represents 600,000 jobs, and it is anticipated that by 10 years from now, 200,000 new jobs could be created. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a very interesting discussion during our session, and I'm looking forward to have the opportunity to discuss live with you during a next conference.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And Christophe Baldery is very willing to take any questions that arise from Marianne's talk. So Marianne was representing local distribution utilities and giving us a French perspective on that. So I'm delighted to ask for the next video to be played, which is being given by Professor Matthew Kahn from the University of Southern California. And Matthew will give us a US perspective on local distribution. So if we could play that video, thank you.
Hello, I'm Matthew Kahn. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California, and I'm delighted to give this brief, and this time I will stick within the time limit, this brief talk about the energy transition and local governance. I will bring this to the United States. all countries are going to have to wrestle with some of these issues, but the United States is known for that states and local governments are very powerful. Of course, there's federal rules, but there's very interesting interplay between federal government in the United States and state and local government. And when I think about the energy transition, we both need in the United States, coal is on the ropes at power plants. Natural gas is still big, and the fracking revolution has played a role there. There's a question of how we fully unleash the potential of wind and solar. These are land-intensive activities, and you probably want to engage in wind and solar where it's sunny and windy. And if that's in the middle of nowhere, you're going to have to site these activities there. There's a question of who owns that land. Is that public land? Who owns it? Where is it? And then there's issues of transmission capacity. I think there hasn't been enough work in energy economics on the geography of transmission cables. There's these awkward issues of NIMBY, not in my backyard. I am a fan of the coast theorem. There's very interesting issues of if there's some windy place in Texas, how do we finance and build wind turbines in that place? And then how do you get that power from that rural West Texas place to the cities? What transmission capacity needs to be built up, and through whose backyard are those things going to go? At what cost is it to bury those things? Has Elon Musk figured out ways to cheaply get from wind farms and solar farms is the cost of transmission capacity going down, both in terms of engineering, but an interesting question is governance, local governance. What is the red tape and the paperwork one has to go through to get power from a wind farm or solar farm to the urbanites who consume it? There's very interesting questions of whether environmentalist communities, like in the Berkeley, Californias, let me back up. In my own research, I've documented that we see an interesting fact that in liberal, progressive environmental communities like Berkeley, California, it's very difficult to build new housing. Environmentalists are educated, sophisticated, and know how to use the court system to block things they don't want to do. Liberal cities are some of the epicenters of NIMBYism. Are we going to see the same thing with the nascent green power revolution? Are we going to see all these lawsuits, perhaps filed to protect turtles, perhaps filed under the Endangered Species Act to slow down green power interests? And while there could be good intentions here, I worry as an environmentalist, and I think Greta Thunberg should worry in terms of the low carbon agenda, is an unintended consequence of local environmentalism to protect the turtles, to protect parks, to protect a Meryl Streep who doesn't want some magnetic wire close to her property. Are we going to see this rise in lawsuits blocking transmission capacity? And if that's the case, I predict we're going to see some interesting urban economics, that we're going to see more wind farms built out in the oceans, because that way you avoid these NIMBY issues because the oceans are common property. But in that case, are marine biologists going to complain and sue, saying that these wind turbines are bugging creatures in the water? And so there's no free lunch here. There's a key piece of economics. When we build this green economy, what is the geography of it? And what currently is sitting on those areas? Are there turtles in Arizona? Are there whales somewhere off the coast of California? Are there Kennedys in Kennebunkport in Maine? I think that's where the bushes are. And so are we going to see this growth in lawsuits? And to my friends in Asia and Europe, is this just a US thing? Are people in the United States really litigious, if I could use a big word? Will we see similar land use concerns in Europe, in India, in Asia, or is this a US thing? It is my hope that those governments that show that they're willing to build solar farms and wind turbines, that they experience economic growth. Because I'm always interested in the green guinea pig effect. For those local governments who show a willingness to get things done and where the local leaders use their clout to stop the frivolous lawsuits and to encourage these projects to get done, will we see those areas boom with the boom of the green economy, of economic growth with lower environmental consequences? And so I think the environmentalist community is going to have to pick its poison. That doesn't sound great. There will be costs of allowing the local green economy to go forward. Will we see environmental lawyers suing, or will the climate change issue take precedent here, and we will see communities not suing and allowing wind turbines and solar farms to be built? As a free market environmentalist, I'm hoping that market forces will drive this. Of course, when there are negative externalities associated with wind turbines, of concerns of chopping up birds, solar panels burning turtles, precautions can be taken to protect these creatures. But I think that this legal issue is very important here, because we have many cases in the United States, in cities ranging from Seattle to Boston to San Francisco to Portland to Santa Monica near me in Los Angeles, that in progressive educated cities, the lawyers come out and exploit local government rules to slow down change. This has contributed to homelessness in many progressive cities. And I worry that it's actually going to slow down the green economy because of this transmission issue. I'm eager to work on this. In wrapping up, because I need this time to stay within my time limits, I am selling my new book, Adapting to Climate Change. And in the back chapter of this Yale Press book, I talk at length about what are new rules of the game that we will need to both adapt to climate change and to reduce our carbon footprint. And a legal culture that is less litigious is part of the equation.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Matthew very kindly gave a very short talk, which was very short and sweet. So thank you to Matthew. Matthew sort of raising some really interesting issues about conflicts between different environmental objectives, which we can come back to in the Q&A. So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, who's Anna Alberini from the University of Maryland, and she's going to take us to the Ukraine for her talk and talk about some of the fuel subsidy issues there.
Thank you for joining me today for a presentation about fuel subsidies and the role of government assistance, energy assistance. We're going to be talking about some general cases, but also we're going to be talking about evidence from Ukraine. My name is Anna Alberini. I'm at the University of Maryland, and I'm sharing with you some information and some results from a study that I did with Nitin Umapati at the World Bank. So we're talking about fuel subsidies. So what does fuel subsidies mean? You have a fuel subsidy when, for whatever reason, fuels or electricity are sold at a price below the marginal cost or the average cost of producing and delivering them to the users. So people also talk about fuel subsidies when the price of electricity or fuels doesn't fully reflect the externalities that are caused by the fuels themselves, such as climate externalities, environmental externalities, traffic externalities, and all that kind of stuff. So fuel subsidies are generally meant well by governments. They're usually imposed to help our households to achieve full electrification in developing countries, to protect the standard of living of the population and the health of the population as well. But of course, they come with a number of disadvantages. So they're expensive. So they, for example, in 2015, globally, they accounted for some over 6% of global GDP, and they're very expensive for the government to run. They're unsustainable exactly for that reason. And plus, there's concerns that if you have excessive consumption, there could be environmental consequences, too much pollution, too many energy security type of issues, too much traffic on the road, which leads to accident if we're talking about fuels that are used in transportation, and this kind of concerns. Also, the moment that you're not charging enough to recover the costs of delivering fuels to people, you're going to have a situation in which the revenues are not going to be enough to guarantee investment in infrastructure. The quality of the service is going to be poor. And so a number of problems are going to be following out of that. And last, people also worry about the possibility that generalized, very universal fuel subsidies are going to be, in the end, helping wealthy households instead of helping the poor ones that they were originally designed to help. So current trends, pretty much worldwide, are towards the elimination, whenever possible, of these subsidies. We have a number of countries that just in the last few years implemented energy pricing reforms, which resulted in the elimination of subsidies. So Argentina, Kuwait, Armenia, we're going to be talking about Ukraine in the rest of this presentation. But also keep in mind that energy pricing reforms could happen as soon as there is the adoption of a carbon tax, for example, or other climate policies that end up changing the price, the tariffs that people have to pay or businesses have to pay to get their energy sources. Needless to say, whenever there is an energy pricing reform, we have concerns about the burden of the energy bills for households and the possibility that actually households are going to be finding themselves thrown into fuel poverty. And so ideally, these reforms should be gradual. Maybe they should be accompanied by some energy assistance in order to be able to sort of, go through the hump of dealing with this kind of consequences and achieving more of an efficient, inclusive of environmental externality, perhaps, type of pricing. So the example that we're going to be talking about today is based on Ukraine. So Ukraine is a former Soviet republic, so it's a transition type of economy. It's a relatively poor country, so the GDP per capita is only about 1/3 that of the average in the European Union. The country has also experienced in the last few years a lot of turmoil, shall we say difficulties with Russia. That's a little bit of an euphemism. But importantly, in addition to all of these problems, it also has a very energy inefficient economy and an economy that really relies very heavily on fossil fuels, which account for at least 2/3 of the energy sources. These fossil fuels are, for the most part, imported, which is creating a situation of energy insecurity. We're going to be focusing in the rest of this presentation about the household sector. So we're talking about buildings that are going to be used for residential type of purposes. And this is a problem in Ukraine because the stock of building is in poor condition and it's generally very energy inefficient. So this graph gives you an example or presents essentially the changes in residential gas tariffs in Ukraine starting from 2013. So originally households were actually organized in such a way that they would be increasing block pricing. And so the prices were reasonably stable in 2013 until about March of 2014, when there was a little bit of an increase. And then in April of 2015, there was a gigantic, a very large increase in prices, about 700% from, essentially overnight, which essentially created a lot of problems for the population. Later, the prices were stabilized. This chart stops at June of 2017, but the reality is that the prices didn't change again until November of 2018, when they went up a tiny little bit, and then they came down again. And so for the last few years, Ukraine has enjoyed relatively stable prices at about 7 hryvnia, that would be the Ukrainian currency, per cubic meter. Interestingly enough, if Ukraine were to impose a carbon tax on residential gas, this carbon tax at the levels that are recommended by international organizations, so between $25 and $40 per ton of CO2, would be roughly comparable in size to the value-added tax that is applied to the tariffs that is included in these tariffs, which is 20%. So this is just for your information, because eventually some form of pricing that will take that into account will have to be included. So what did the government do to help people that were facing such a dramatic increase in prices? They resorted to an existing energy assistance program, the so-called HUS, or Housing and Utility Subsidy. And so you can see from this chart that this HUS was given to under 2 million people until about 2014. Then in 2015, of course, there was a large increase in tariffs, and so the numbers started bumping up until they came to almost about 9 million households receiving the subsidies by the end of 2017. Now, 9 million households in Ukraine is essentially 50% of the households. So we're talking about an energy assistance program that is really, really widespread. And in fact, it became very quickly in 2015 and 2016, it became the largest assistance program by the government, second only to pensions, government pensions. How does the HUS work? So in general, it's money that you receive, but it's simply a deduction from the utility bill. So in other words, until May 2019, the households didn't receive any cash. They simply received a deduction, a reduction of the utility bills. It's calculated following two parts. So one part is essentially looking at the bills that would be paid if consumption of a particular type of fuel, such as electricity or natural gas or district heating, were equal to normative consumption. Normative consumption is calculated by the authority essentially following a spreadsheet, a very simple algorithm, where normative consumption depends on the size of the house, on the size of the family, on the type of house that it is, if it's in a building, how many floors the building has, and all this kind of stuff. Then there is an adjustment that is proportional to income. And as you can imagine, the more income you make, the less you're going to be getting as part of the HUS assistance. The HUS covers electricity, natural gas, district heating, and also water and sewage. So these are the research questions that we're asking and seeking to answer, as we will see in just a few minutes. So first of all, did this kind of energy assistance program actually help the population, especially the most vulnerable segments? Or did it end up actually helping large consumers that are also wealthy consumers, and so they don't particularly need any help? And are there any alternate designs of the HUS that actually would be performing better in terms of, still having welfare effects, but reducing government costs, which is something that we can think about as a more permanent type of energy assistance that could also help towards a transition to a different type of energy supply. All right, so we're using data from several ways of the Ukraine household budget survey, so from 2014 all the way to 2019, and then we blended that with information about the gas tariffs and consumer price indices and heating degree days. And we selected a sample that is using natural gas for space heating. So they're using natural gas usually with a boiler to heat their apartments. The majority of these homes are using radiators, just like is very common in Europe. We're focusing on residences that are both single-family homes as well as unit in multifamily buildings that sort of gave up the idea of doing district heating. And we have enough information, enough stability in the prices that we can actually calculate a demand function, so we can calculate an actual physical quantity from the reported expenditure, at least for 2017 and 2018. So key findings from our research. First of all, we found that there was no substitution into other fuels as the price of natural gas went up. So people really just stayed with the natural gas consumption that they had, and they pretty much had to somehow face the bill. We also found that gas consumption is really not very strongly correlated with income. And I can show you a little bit of a slide here. We organize people into income quartiles and consumption of gas quartiles. Consumption is, of course, expressed in cubic meters. And if you're looking at the rows here, so the percentages in the rows add to 100%, and so they need to be read in this way. We're looking at each income quartile, and we're looking at the percentage of the people in the first income quartile, for example, that are falling in each of these consumption quartiles. And you can see that actually there's a fairly even distribution. So you can see that, the percentages that fall in the first and second and the third quartile are really the same. And even the percentage that falls into the fourth quartile is actually not a small one at all. Likewise, for the second and the third income quartile, where the distribution is actually very, very even-handed across all of the quartiles of consumption, and even for the wealthiest people, so in the top quartile of the distribution of income in our sample, as you can see, it is true that there's a slightly higher percentage in the fourth consumption quartile, but the truth is that these numbers are fairly even between themselves. And so that was the first of our findings. The second one of our findings is that there were some changes over time in the way that the HUS, the money or the discount that you're getting on your bills, was distributed across households that belong to different quintiles. So, or different portions of the distribution of income. So you can see that in 2014, for example, the almost 50% of the money, of the HUS money, was actually received by households in the first quintile of income, of the distribution of income, so the poorest households. But by the time we're moving to 2016 and 2017, so after the HUS has been revamped and has been expanded to cover a lot of households, like 50% of the households, you can see that the distribution is really, really even among all of the different, quintiles of the distribution of income. And only later, with 2018 and 2019, it seems to be more in favor of the poorer households than the richer ones. This graph is actually showing the histogram of consumption of gas. The pink bars are supposed to be representing the people that actually received the HUS, the subsidies, the energy assistance. The blue ones are the ones that didn't. And so one question that arises here is whether the HUS is actually given to people because they consume more, or it helps them consume more. So which is coming first? The answer is, of course, that a little bit of both is the truth. The truth is a little bit of both. We can also look at determining the effect of the HUS by looking at the share of net income that is spent on energy type of expenditure, so electricity, gas, and fuels. So here we're doing a comparison between the households that didn't receive the HUS and the households that did. And so you can see that after 2014, so starting with 2016, because I don't have reliable data for 2015, the percentage of net income accounted for by energy expenditure was about 11% and fairly stable for households that didn't qualify for the HUS. Among the recipients, actually, this percentage was lower, indicating that the HUS was helping them keep these expenditure in check. An interesting point here is that if 11% is the average of income essentially spent on energy, this chart is essentially indicating that among the households that didn't receive the HUS, essentially the average household was a household that faced fuel poverty. If we're adopting the usual definition that fuel poverty applies to a household that spends more than 10% of income on energy. We can also look at how the HUS helped the households essentially relieve themselves of fuel poverty. And you can see that in 2014, prior to the big increase in prices, if everybody had to pay the bills without receiving any HUS, that would be essentially 29% of the sample would be facing fuel poverty. The presence of the HUS means that only about 14% of the sample is facing fuel poverty. But as you can see, after the big reform in the prices, the big increase in prices, this percentage went up dramatically if there was no HUS. And the presence of the HUS was able to actually reduce the percentage of households that are facing fuel poverty by about 50%. So it cut it in half. But still, having that a third of the sample is facing fuel poverty is really not exactly a stellar type of performance. So fuel poverty remains very high in Ukraine. We also did so we estimated a demand function, and we're taking advantage of the fact that essentially the HUS is reducing the actual effective price that you're paying on each unit of natural gas that you're buying. And based on this, essentially, we calculated the gains, the welfare gains that are made possible by the HUS itself. So we're calculating this essentially as the opposite sign of what it would happen if you were to remove the HUS completely. And this is an interesting result. First of all, we find that on average, the HUS is giving a level of consumer surplus, or a gaining consumer surplus that accounts for about 6.5% of net income, which is a very large share. We also look at the distribution of this between income quartiles and consumption quartiles. And as you can see, within an income quartile, actually the numbers are increased slightly as we increase consumption for the first income quartile, and also for the second as well. But they're relatively flat for the third and the fourth. And in absolute value, these figures are actually really, really similar. Which means that many households of whatever their level of income was actually enjoyed an increase in consumer surplus thanks to the HUS. Needless to say, the percentage of income is going to be higher, so it's going to be up to 14% among the poorest household, but in the wealthiest household, it's going to be no more than 2.5 or 3%. So here's an interesting exercise. So we know that the HUS is not really sustainable. So it takes about 2.5% of GDP. So we looked at different exercises in which we experimented with different variations on the HUS. So what would happen if we took it away entirely? So we have learned that there would be a loss of consumer surplus that is equal to 6.5 or about 7% of income. Gas consumption would be reduced by 8%. And there would be a big savings for the government. The savings would be equal to about 2.5% of GDP. If we cut it in half, actually there would be a very modest loss of consumer surplus. Gas consumption would be cut by about 4%, and there would be considerable savings for the government. We can also play with other things like decoupling entirely the HAS from consumption and link it entirely to the poverty line or to the income of the people, which results in large welfare loss and saves money to the government only under the most miserly, the most restrictive or the least generous scenario. We can look at partially cutting the HAS and combining that with social tariffs, which actually does have an element of sustainability. Or, and this is my personal favorite solution, how about converting or combining the HAS into a subsidy to energy efficiency upgrades? So the government of Ukraine actually does have a number of energy efficiency programs, and the one that applies the most to households is the Warm Loans program, in which households essentially have to borrow money to do energy efficiency upgrades in their homes, such as changing windows, changing the boiler, putting insulation in the walls, etc. The government essentially reimburses between 20 and 25% of the principal of the loans, but doesn't reimburse necessarily the interest. So we did some simple calculations here. So based on the average project cost, which is about 18,000 hryvnias, and if you're assuming that the household is going to be putting down, paying out of its own pocket 50% of that, and then taking out a loan where that would be for the remaining 50%, just based on simple math and our own assessment of the effectiveness of these efficiency interventions, the savings in the energy expenses, so the savings in the gas expenses, would be sufficient to essentially let the project pay itself back. And so to me, this is an interesting exercise that shows that a much, much simpler type of thing, a one-time payment rather than something that you have to give the households every single time and for every single heating season, has really good potential in terms of helping people in the wrong time, in the long run, helping them have a more sustainable level of consumption, and helping them in the future if prices were to be increased because of climate policies or because of the carbon tax. So in sum, we've seen that in some situation, when a country is poor, when there have been subsidies going on for the longest time, a sudden raising of tariffs can actually create a situation of fuel poverty for a lot of households. We've seen an example of a particular energy assistance program, which actually delivered a lot of help to the people, delivered a lot of help to people in different segments of the distribution of income, not necessarily to just the wealthy, although it did help heavy consumers. We've seen a number of possible redesigns. We calculated essentially the savings to the government and the welfare loss associated with different designs. And we saw that perhaps the most promising in terms of sustainability and long-term type of consequences might indeed be switching the energy assistance to an energy upgrade assistance program. And with this, I thank you, and I'm welcoming comments and suggestions.
Thank you very much, Anna. So Anna reminding us that there are real people paying electricity bills in countries, and that anything that we do to bills has to we need to take into account the fuel poverty effect. So thank you for that. So we'll go to our final talk now. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Michael Caramanis from Boston University, and Michael's going to be talking about the use of locational pricing within the distribution system. So we'll play his video.
Hello, this is Michael Caramanis. I'm happy to be addressing such a distinguished audience. Thank you to Professor Yannick Perez for inviting me, and thanks to Michel Pollitt, who is chairing this session. I would like to say a few things on the value proposition of understanding and employing electricity distribution network location and time-specific marginal costs. So what's the purpose of understanding these marginal costs as they vary over time and space? It's very important so that we can essentially deal with the challenges of renewable generation that is posing issues we have to address. And these issues can be addressed either with excessive cost and investment, or with coordinating the consumption and the generation at the distribution network, which is connected at the distribution network. So this is something that's of great importance, and which depends very much on our understanding and of marginal costs, and our ability to communicate these marginal costs and and use them to coordinate distribution network connected demand and generation, small generation. So distributed energy resources in general are going to be addressed here through those marginal costs. The challenges are ones that we've seen that have to do with the fact that we cannot control when we get the renewable generation output. The famous duck curve shows that when the sun shines, we get so much power that the net demand kind of bottoms down, and then it picks up in a fast manner that requires a lot of capacity in conventional generation, and high costs for meeting those ramps that result. The spatial, so this is the time sort of component, if you wish. The space or the spatial component is very much elaborated in these costs here, which you see depicting with the red high cost or high marginal cost locations, and with green low marginal cost locations. And you see that in a matter of a few hours, the locational distribution of these costs changes radically. So can we then deal with the congestion in the transmission networks that's causing these shifts? Can we deal with these different costs by essentially managing demand, by shifting demand from high cost to low cost areas, and delaying demand from high cost hours to low cost hours, and so on and so forth. So this is something that indeed can be done, and renewable generation can be dealt with by turning around the paradigm of generation catering and following demand to demand catering to the availability of generation, congestion in the networks, and so on and so forth. So for example, data centers, which today are very important consumers of electricity and growing in their consumption of electricity faster than any other than many other types of consumption, can transport using fiber lines information that then is processed at a faraway data server farm at a lower cost. Shorter distance mobility is also available with electric vehicles that are going to become important consumers of electricity, that can move around and alleviate such issues. Finally, sort of short distance value power supply is very much related with the voltage variability within acceptable bounds, but nevertheless important in terms of increasing consumption to voltage sensitive loads. And distributed energy resources, if they see the marginal cost or the marginal value of producing or consuming compensation of reactive power, which is a capability that that power electronics that we find today with chargers of electric vehicles and rooftop photovoltaic panels, for example, where those inverters transform direct current to alternating current and inject into the network. They can provide this coordination, and this is an example of how this multitude of small power electronics that accompany distributed energy resources can actually flatten the voltage levels in a distribution network. So here is a depiction of transmission and distribution network, very sort of sketchy. You can see that the transmission network is kind of meshed. You can have congestion of transmission lines there. And in the distribution network, which is kind of radial, you have all sorts of important and flexible and degrees of freedom owning types of consumption, such as electric vehicles, smart thermostats for heating and cooling, rooftop photovoltaics, and so on and so forth, that have, as I mentioned previously, the ability to compensate. So losses are much higher in the distribution network, and line losses, and also the degradation of transformers is extremely important, and that is what should inform the marginal cost, the locational marginal cost, and assist with the coordination of distributed energy resources that have degrees of freedom and can be coordinated. Electric vehicles I have in mind, as I mentioned, that can move around, can charge here or there, can charge now or later. Whereas, of course, there are still quite inelastic forms of demand. So this coordination that can be done from an active network that is cognizant of spatio-temporal marginal costs and conveys these marginal costs, shows these marginal costs to distributed energy resources such as electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles can make sure that they do not charge at the same time unless they absolutely need to, but if they can wait, they can delay to a different hour, and they can move around so that a particular service transformer, let's say, is not overloaded at the same time, loses its life, and so on and so forth. So the investment in service transformers, which will have to be quite sizable when the transportation industry is electrified, is going to be much smaller and utilized much better if we can coordinate and avoid the loss of life. So you can see the opportunities that are there if you have coordination of all of these distributed energy resources. I've already talked about the differences between transmission distribution network costs and the requirements in transmission and in distribution. Let me just highlight that distribution networks can see their assets, primarily service transformers, that are responsible for 5 to 10% of the investment in the assets of a distribution network, can be managed, can be saved can have their life saved and can be utilized in a much more rational fashion, and avoid having to invest for a peak hour and put in a lot of high investment in a manner that is going to be utilized very poorly. So here's a depiction of the transmission network and the distribution networks that are at the fringes of the transmission network. And you can see that they share a node and a marginal cost kind of location for providing electricity, injecting or withdrawing electricity, the value of injecting electricity, the cost of withdrawing electricity at the interface of the transmission system and distribution system. And then the distribution system has many more locations, much higher granularity, smaller consumers at those smaller buses that may see very radically different marginal costs. So looking at the wholesale markets at the transmission level, the marginal cost at a particular location that's closest to where we live and so on and so forth can be quite misleading, because the granularity of the locational marginal costs varies. So you see here in a study that we did in upstate New York, how the locational marginal price, the marginal costs at the interface between the transmission distribution network may be quite different from the actual granularity of the costs. If that granularity of the costs is made available for scheduling distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, space conditioning, smart transformers, and so on and so forth, the costs can be much lower, both to those users and to the system overall, which allows even inelastic and non-degrees of freedom owning types of consumption to benefit as well. So, so this is why we need to understand marginal costs at a very fine granularity, and using them to coordinate distributed energy resources can realize the desideratum, if you wish, of having the demand side follow the supply side, because this is the new reality that we'll be faced with if we want to decarbonize and to rely on clean energy generation. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to participate in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you to everyone who has just recorded their talk. And I'm delighted to open up the panel discussion now, and thank you to everyone who has asked a question. I'm going to pick up some of the questions that have been asked on the chat and pose them to my panel. So let me just get you all up so I can see you. So can I start by asking the question which I think was mentioned by someone in the chat. Where does energy efficiency fit into the local energy transition? You know, if we want to match supply and demand locally, do we need to encourage local communities to get their demand down so that's easier to do? Does anyone want to comment on that? Michael.
Actually, there's no real dichotomy. It's not distribution location. It's not LMP, location management prices, plus D. The distribution cost may be higher or lower, but it still ties into the overall cost that is happening at the interface. I think that local costs should be captured as much as global costs or transmission costs. The overall sort of sharing of the cost is a little bit more than 50% of the cost occurring at the high voltage, at the centralized transmission level, with where we have big generators with high fuel costs and so on and so forth, and a little bit less than half occurs at the distribution level. So those two should be meshed together and should be matched. And there's actually no dichotomy. There's no conflict between global and local desires for for being efficient and for saving the environment.
Okay, thank
you. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, if I have well understood your question was based on energy efficiency. My main message is, yes, that's true that the tariff for the grid access are an information to generate energy efficiency, but it's not only the same criteria which will move that. You have the cost of power itself, which will generate energy efficiency. And what I can refer to be concrete and to give some numbers. I would like to refer to a scenario book that we have published. I don't know if you can see it. I cannot, so it's not here, but you will find it on Enedis website. We have made a scenario-based approach, and if we are starting from the municipalities within the bottom-up approach with the 36,000 municipalities that we have in France, and if we aggregate that to national level, we reach after 50 years an increase of between 0.2 and 1.2 increase of the energy demand in France, which is including in this range a lot of energy efficiency and sometimes a very little amount of energy efficiency. So the range is not very significant, because on some scenario you are using some high level GDP growth, in some other you have low level GDP growth, combined with an investment in the grid or in the energy efficiency systems in the household. At the end, the impact is the combined impact is not very significant over the period. But this can be discussed. This could be the object of another presentation, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so what's happening at the household level may be important. And I'm sure you've got something to say about energy efficiency, because surely there must have been a huge increase in energy efficiency in the Ukraine when prices went up 700%.
You think, but the reality is that energy efficiency costs money. And so that was the reason why they started a number of programs to help people actually pay for these investments, which can be as simple as changing window, but you still need money for that, or putting up insulation, or changing the boiler to a more efficient one. So in Ukraine, the story is a little more complicated. Obviously, you guys are more interested in generation and distribution, transmission and distribution of electricity. With gas, you don't really generate gas; you just acquire it from someplace else, and then you're channeling it, through pipelines, to reach the final user. Actually, it turns out that even the transmission, through the pipelines was subject to a bunch of losses, so part of the efficiency improvement could have already been achieved by improving the pipeline system itself. At the level of the household, I'm very much in favor of improving efficiency, in the consumption of gas and everything. As I said, it's costly. Interventions in somebody's home are not necessarily something that can be done overnight. They take a certain amount of planning. They certainly take a certain amount of money. They are still, they have a number of programs, but the complete upgrade of the stock of buildings is not there yet. So I would say that maybe no more than 10% of the existing homes have been availing themselves of some of these programs to do energy efficiency improvements.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me ask you another question, which was sort of an underlying theme in Matt's talk. What's the potential for sort of behavioral change due to sort of environmental commitments or localism? I mean, can we sort of harness, citizens say they're interested in doing something about climate change or cleaning up the local environment. Any observations about how behavior towards energy consumption can be changed? I suppose that's non-price behavior. Christoph, you've got every household in, or almost every household in France connected to your network. What have you learned from all the smart meter data that you've been getting back?
Yeah, the smart meters are just getting implemented. So we are, as a DSO, we are not proposing any contract for supply of energy. This is the role of suppliers. But we put this information available, of course, for the user. They can know their own consumption in real time, and they can compare that with information we send them with some neighbors to see if they are consuming more or less. Is the shape of their demand is comparable to the one of their neighbors, but we do not go to the end of proposing an alternative contract, because this is not our role. We are giving the information, and we try to, on the other hand, what we try to do is to invest in a grid extension in an area where the network is fragile because of new demand, like electric vehicles, like distributed generation. So we are managing the investment, but not the demand itself on the grid. That's it. I hope I'm clear.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, any behavioral observations from the Ukraine? I mean, how do you persuade households to take energy efficiency measures? I thought, any good experiences there?
Yeah, I would abandon Ukraine for just 1 second, to think about, how an economist would like to get households to change their behavior. We would like to do it through pricing, for example. But the, many of the schemes that are supposed to be appropriate for, marginal, pricing that is consistent with the cost of generation and this kind of stuff are so complicated. If you have real-time pricing or time of use or something like that, or schemes like, IBR, increasing block rates or something. Are these schemes too complicated for people to actually manage to absorb the price signal, or can people actually respond to these things? So this is a big question and a big line of research, as a matter of fact. In the case of, I would say that in most European households, including Ukraine, but including, I'm sure, France and Italy, where I'm from, and all this kind of stuff, people are not wasteful. People do turn off the lights, when they leave a room and this kind of stuff. Here in the United States, I chase my husband around the house because every room he goes in, he walks in and he leaves the lights on. So it's really a cultural, there's a cultural element, I would say, in Europe towards conservation that represents a good base to build on. How much more you can do? Perhaps you can educate people about the importance of energy efficiency. You can try to study some form of pricing that is more readily absorbed by people. And you can also realize that for the majority of people, I hate to say this, but the electricity and the gas expenditure, unless you're in the Ukraine, are really not that big of a part of their budget, of their expenses. And so it's easy for them to forget if they enroll in one of these programs in which you're making a bet with your neighbor to see who's conserving more. It's easy to lose interest because really the payoff is relatively limited. So we need to think of something else.
Michael, any behavioral change observations?
Very much so. Under behavioral change, I would classify the impact of operational planning, of short-term change in one's behavior, particularly in the context of new types of demand. The old types of demand are going to be inelastic. I'm not going to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to study. This is fairly inelastic demand. However, with minor automation, I can adapt. I can reschedule the charging of my vehicle. I can adapt the preheating and the pre-cooling of my home, and this talks about a huge link between planning, long-term planning, and operational planning. So in our studies, and I'd like to refer to Christophe's comments, a fragile part of the distribution network may need investment in order to be able to host more electric vehicles, right? Well, if the hosting of electric vehicles can be twice as much for the same investment, if those electric vehicles have the information to adapt to sort of local congestion. So then if I go ahead and invest according to some assumption that does not take into consideration this adaptation, I'm wasting resources. I'm investing too much. I'm going to end up with stranded assets. So this is extremely important, and this is something that happens at the distribution network. You actually consume the assets. Transformers, service transformers are consumed. You can consume 50 hours in 1 hour if you overload them. Same thing to a lesser extent, but the same thing on distribution lines. So taking into consideration this interaction is extremely important, and that of course has to do with a behavioral change, but that behavioral change is assisted with affordable and fairly low-cost automation, such as smart thermostats or some smart capability in electric vehicle chargers that can take advantage of information. And of course, they're making this information available through platforms, through, think of the Amazon, that links together electric vehicles and such. The cost of information is going down. The cost of using this information, the automation of using information goes down. So therefore, long-term and short-term operational planning are very important, and I think we can benefit from linking them up.
Thanks, Michael. I'll give you a quick response to that because I do want to get on to locational pricing. Yeah, go on, Christophe.
Very quick, just to say I agree with Michael's approach, and I confirm that with the load control, for instance, for EV, we can save a lot of investment in the grid. You are totally right. That's all.
Great, thank you. Okay, Michael, I'll come back to you at the end of this question because you give your sort of talk on it. But let me sort of raise the issue of locational pricing within the distribution system. And I'm going to start with you, Christophe, because your CEO didn't seem to mention anything to do with pricing differentially across France. And if there was anybody in the world who could do locational pricing across the distribution system, it's surely Enedis, because you're a big company, you can socialize all the costs if you need to. So you should be number one in the queue for locational pricing within the distributional system. So are you doing it? Are you thinking of doing it? Why wouldn't you do it?
Okay. I'm happy of your question, because I wanted information that we are the only, that this system is not existing anywhere else in the world. So it's not existing. Thank you for the confirmation. We are, of course, paying a lot of attention to that. First, two things. One thing is that power grid investments are long-term investment. We have to anticipate this. It takes time to be built, to get the approval, and then to give when we want to give the right price signal in real time, we are changing our time frame. So this is something very different. So what we want to do is to listen to what the municipalities local are asking. And so we want to act as an enabler. If they want distributed generation, okay, we will develop the grid to facilitate decentralized generation. Some do not want that. I don't know why, but forgive me, some do not want that. So we have to deal with that. And so what my CEO said is that we are an enabler for the energy transition if people are willing to that. And if I look at the discussion which is on the panel, there are some people asking if people are willing to change the system, the consumers, I mean. And I have not the answer. We should make a panel to see that, but this is not easy to find. What I can tell is that people, territories want more autonomy, and we are answering this question. Then also what she said is that we need also some solidarities between territories in different geographies. So having an average, and excuse me, Michael, an average price, both Michaels, an average price is a way to make sure that we can bring power from the rural area where you have a lot of distributed generation to the city downtown where you have less distributed generation, if no. And so you need some power transmission lines between the two, and which have to be financed by somebody. Which municipalities, the rurality or the cities? And then you come to the idea of solidarity between territories in the shape, not when we were to electrify France, but today when we are talking of ecological transition, we have to raise the question of who should we help, the municipality or the cities? And so where to put the local prices in which city? So this is a debate which is open, and we are discussing on that, and the debate is not finished. I would be pleased to continue that with all of you. So I have not an answer now, but this is under study, and we can discuss that.
Okay, great. I hope Michael will respond to that. Anna, what are your views on use of more locational pricing within the electricity system to better reflect costs?
Me? Are you asking me? Sorry.
I thought it was asking me, but maybe I misheard you.
Yeah. I'm asking you, Anna, first, and then I'll go to Michael.
So, so to the extent essentially they were like, equalizing, the people are paying essentially in a manner that is proportional or equal to the marginal cost, my views would be favorable to that. I'm just trying to go through my head, and trying to think of what sort of like, behavioral adverse and unintended behavioral responses that could generate. But to be completely honest with you, I doubt that people are going to be moving to a different location just because the price of electricity is cheaper there, or move away from another location just because the price of electricity is, is more expensive. So I don't imagine that you would have, such a pronounced behavioral response that the entire system would be going kaput. just because people are doing things that we were not anticipating. In general, I mean, I would be favorable to the idea. How feasible that is, that's something for you guys, for the electricity systems, et cetera, DSOs to figure out.
Thank you. Okay, Michael. It's a very skeptical audience for some of your pricing suggestions. So why do you think you can sort of get it implemented? And there were some interesting questions on the chat about, okay, what's the practicality of having sort of locational prices down to the distribution level?
Well, the practicality may not be as evident right now, but it will be much more important. The practicality will be much more sort of essential and key as we see 30% of our consumption going to electric vehicles, as opposed to almost nil right now. And then the sort of the mobility issue, you may not decide to live in Times Square because prices are cheaper, but you may be happy to charge your vehicle at work or at home. So there are mobilities there that can be taken advantage of. Number one. Number two, there's and I didn't emphasize that, but there's no problem with having different contracts, different rates coexist. So you can have average cost pricing and you can have marginal cost pricing that is relevant for some types of consumption and not relevant for others. Number one. Number two, it is essentially, your whatever you do, you're going to have some sort of a two-part tariff where you have a variable marginal cost based portion of the tariff and a fixed cost of the tariff that sort of is an equalizer. However, if you give the advantage of responding to marginal cost prices to those who can, to those who have the degrees of freedom and can do that, then you actually benefit. I mean, it's incredible how much you benefit everybody else. You do.
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean, great point about mobility does change things, doesn't it? Because it gets you away from the sort of fixed taxation element of just taxing people's location of people's house. Okay, let me. This is going to be, I think, perhaps our last question. So do give concise answers to this. But there was a sort of great question which was about the conflict between local and national environmentalism, and how do you reflect local preferences in the electricity system? And again, this must be something that you've got good experience of from different locations. So, Christoph, how do you reflect the fact that, people in one municipality do want to underground their wire, or they don't want the wind turbine next to them, and they're actually prepared to pay more for that? Or whatever. I mean, how do you sort of reflect these local preferences in planning the network, for instance?
When people want to build a new house in the middle of nowhere, we have the capacity to announce a price for the connection, which make us sure that he will contribute to his desire to be away from anybody. But on the other hand, we make some assumptions that somebody else will come in the neighborhood in the future. So we will socialize part of this investment to the future potential users. So this is a way, one example of how what flexibility we have to take into account some very, very local demands. We can also, we have now a new kind of contract when a new, and I will be short now, when a local supplier wants to make a big wind farm which will generate a grid extension, we propose him in the contract to to be flexible at the peak hours and to not to deliver the maximum power that it could technically do. So this is in the contract. So this is one tool that we have, but of course we are not the regulator and we cannot decide the whole tariff structure. So this is one way that we can use to take into account some very local issues.
Thank you. Anna, any good experiences on taking account some of these local issues from you?
So not really. I don't have a lot of experience in this area. So I'm just thinking that, generally speaking, unless you're really planning to relocate based on how electricity is generated in the area where you live or you work or something like that, there isn't that much recourse, you have against that. I'm just thinking that in lots of developing countries or poorer countries, the local environmental preferences or the global environmental preferences right now are not a priority. These people are more concerned about, paying for food and paying for the basic electricity and actually even dealing with problems like, outages, irregular supply or something like this, so for a lot of people, that's not a priority yet. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, quick last word, Michael. Any examples of taking local preferences into account from the US?
Yeah, I mean, local preferences are important, but again, if we are to try to quantify them, they reveal themselves through congestion costs. You may be on the one side of the congestion barrier or the other, and how do you diminish this? Again, you can get guidance as to how the network should be planned and should be extended in order to diminish these congestions. Because you can actually calculate in the marginal cost, you can calculate network rent, the rent or the sort of the value that having additional capacity to diminish congestion is a quite important guidance in planning and so on. Then the interaction of various networks, the gas network, the natural gas network, and the electricity network are extremely important, and those two can be coordinated through marginal cost. For example, we've seen in many situations, because there are combustion turbines that require gas at the same time that the city gate requires gas for the city residents and so on. So how can we coordinate these two networks? The natural gas network can store, for example, through line packing and so on at various segments. And this is something that you plan. So it's operational planning is very important, planning a day ahead, where to store, where to line pack, how to schedule your operational planning, and then real time. So sorry.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. A great thanks to everyone who spoke, and thank you in particular to Christoph, Michael, and Anna, who were here to take questions. And thank you to all of you who were asking questions and participating in this great session. As we've seen, there are lots of discussions that we could continue into the future. So thank you for being with us.